few months ago, visiting Switzerland, I had the opportunity of spending an afternoon in the archive of one of the great 20th century theologians, a notably complex and austere writer. In one section of the archive were the books that had been found in his private quarters, and they included a large collection of Georgette Heyer novels. It's hard to think of any more humanizing discovery than that. But it's a reminder that our habit of looking at other people's bookshelves when we're in their rooms in order to discover more about them is something that has its uses. We like to understand the material repertoire that people are drawing on in making sense of their lives. And it's with that in mind that I propose in these lectures to look at three very different historians from the early Middle Ages, with the question in mind of what their library consisted in. What was the book culture which they inherited? What did they instinctively quote, and equally importantly, what did they expect to be recognized by their readership and their audience? All of them, as I've said, are historians. That's to say, they're constructing a narrative of the society they inhabit, and in constructing such a narrative, they're constructing the society itself. No chronicler is ever simply a passive recording machine of history, but someone who is actively creating a social world and an imaginative world. Hence the subtitles of my lectures: The Invention of Britain, The Invention of England, and The Invention of Wales. And I want to suggest in these lectures that looking at the building blocks that are used for these acts of invention in our three chroniclers gives us not only a sense of what was going on in the early Middle Ages, but a sense of what continues to contribute in one way or another to the picture we have and the story we tell about the identity of this society in Britain. The drawback, of course, is that prior to 700, our sources are very limited indeed. Before 700, there are only two writers we can unambiguously say are British in their formation and their major work. And those are St. Patrick and Gildas, the main subject of this first lecture, writing in the late 5th and mid-6th centuries. There are, in fact, just to do justice to the whole scene, two other writers, allegedly born in Britain, who play a very significant part in the intellectual life of the 5th and 6th centuries: the heretic Pelagius and the monastic writer and theologian Faustus of Riez. Both are identified as Britons in our sources. Both are exceptionally sophisticated and eloquent writers, somewhat controversial in their way. But our problem is that we have absolutely no way of knowing how much of their intellectual formation took place in Britain and how much abroad. The chances are that neither of them had their primary formation in Britain, and both of them, of course, had their career almost entirely outside Britain. Their presence haunts the discussion and prompts some interesting marginal questions, and I'll be referring to them once or twice. But the focus of what I want to say has to do with those who can be identified as clearly British in education and in career. Patrick wrote a confession. That's to say, a statement of self-defense, almost certainly addressed to a synod of unsympathetic British bishops who thought that his activities in converting the Irish were over-enthusiastic. He also wrote an extremely rude letter to a British king who had conducted a raid on one of Patrick's convert settlements in Ireland. Patrick, in his confession, a truly fascinating text, speaks of his own experience as someone kidnapped by Irish slavers as a teenager. and describes the long years he spent in Ireland as a slave, his eventual, extremely exciting story of escape, his visits to Christian communities in Gaul, his return to Ireland, his travels between Ireland and Britain, and some of his achievements as an evangelist in Ireland. He admits faults in the past, though we don't discover exactly what they are. He expresses through gritted teeth his respect and profound disagreement for and with the British bishops with whom he's arguing. But for our purposes this evening, one of the most interesting things he says is that he writes rather bad Latin because his education was interrupted. He was kidnapped and enslaved in his mid-teens. And as far as we can see, that means that he had, as the child of a reasonably well-to-do family of